In this lecture, we are going to talk about the skeleton of the head. We'll talk about the bones of the cerebral cranium, namely occipital, frontal, parietal bones. We'll also talk about the ethmoid and the sphenoid bones. Right, so according to our syllabus, this is topic 5 and 6. Right, so the scale is primarily the receptacle for the most highly developed parts of the nervous system, the brain, and the sensory organs connected with it. That's the organ of seeing, hearing, tasting, and smelling. It also encloses the initial part of the digestive system and the respiratory tracts communicating with the external environment. Right, so there are two parts, right? The skull can be divided into two parts. The cerebral cranium, right? I like to call it the neurocranium or cranium cerebrale, right? So those are the Latin names. The second part is the visceral cranium. I like to call it viscerocranium or cranium viscerale. Another name, splanocranium, and another name, cranium faciale. All right, so let's talk more about the cerebral cranium. Right, so it's divided into the skull cap or the vault, the Latin name calvria, and the second part is the base of the skull. All right, it's called basis cranii. Right, so this base of the skull, you are going to see it as we go on with our lectures, right? But for now, you need to know that this basis cranii is two parts: the external cranial base, that's basis cranii externa, and the internal cranial base, that's the basis cranii interna, right? So this is the basic classification you need to know about the bones of the skull, like all of them, right? So I told you, you divide it into what? Neurocranium and viscerocranium. And these bones, some of them are paired and some are unpaired, right? So paired and unpaired bones, right? So starting with the bones of the neurocranium, the paired bones are temporal and parietal bones, right? Only these two are paired, temporal and parietal. Unpaired bones include the frontal bone, occipital bone, sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone. Right, that's all about the neurocranium. Viscerocranium, it is a lot of paired bones, right? The maxilla, palatine bones, inferior nasal conch, zygomatic bone, nasal bones, and the lacrimal bones, right? So those are the paired bones, and unpaired bones include the vomer, mandible, and the hyoid. Right, so let's talk about these bones individually, starting with the frontal bone, Latin name os frontale. Right, so the frontal bone is made up of three parts: the frontal sguama, right, sguama frontalis, two orbital parts, that's partes orbitales, right, there are two, and then the nasal part, that's pars nasalis, right? So you can say the frontal bone is four parts, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4, but I just named them 3 for some reason, right? This is the frontal bone, the external surface, right? So on the external surface here, you can see the frontal tubercle, right? The tuber frontale. You can also see the squamous part, squama frontalis, right? And here, if you look here down here, you can see the glabella, right? So initially, like during neonatal period, there are two, but they fuse together, right? So you see this this part is called a glabella, right? If you look here, you can see the temporal surface of the frontal bone. That's the facies temporalis. And there is a line here. It's called a linea temporalis. Linea temporalis. If you look here, just above the orbit here, this is called the superciliary arch, right? Arcus superciliaris, right? Arcus superciliaris. And there you can see a foramen, the supraorbital foramen supraorbitale, right? You can see it here and here, right on the medial angle here. There is a notch. It's called a frontal notch. That's incisura frontalis. And this process is called what? A zygomatic process of the frontal bone, right? So this process articulates with the zygomatic bone. So it's called what? Processus zygomaticus, labeled this side, right? Okay, that's the external surface. So this is the internal surface, right? On the internal surface, here you can see the first thing. There is this sulcus, right? Is sulcus sinus sagittalis superior, right? Grooves formed by the arteries, so sulci arteriosi, right? Sulci arteriosi. Here is the orbital part, right? The orbital part of the frontal bone, right? So the orbital part is two surfaces. The orbital surface of the orbital part of the frontal bone and the cerebral surface of the orbital part of the frontal bone. Yeah, right. So this is the cerebral part. You can see the impressions here, right? Impressionis digitate, all right? Impressionis digitate. Right, and also a continuation here, a continuation of this superior sagittal sinus is called what? A crest frontalis. That's the frontal crest, right? And here there is a blind foramen. It's called a foramen caecum. Foramen caecum, right? And this is the orbital surface of the orbital part, right? Because I showed you in the internal surface there was the what? There was the cerebral part, right? So here there is firstly there is a fossa for the lacrimal gland on the lateral part. So it's fossa glandulae lacrimalis, right? Here on the medial part, you can see the spine, right? A trochlear spine, spina trochlearis. And here is the supraorbital margin, margo supraorbitalis, right? Here you can see the notch, the supraorbital notch, incisura supraorbitalis. And here you can see a depression. There is a depression. It's called what? A fovea trochlearis. Fovea trochlearis. And here you will see the nasal spine, spina nasalis. Spina nasalis. In the middle part here, there is a notch for the ethmoid bone. You will see it at the end, right? And these cells, like they articulate, like they belong actually to the ethmoid. So anterior, middle, and posterior ethmoidal cells. That's how it will articulate, right? Okay, so the next bone is the occipital. The occipital bone, os occipitale, is the basilar part, which is located anteriorly. The two lateral or condylar parts, that's partes lateralis, which are located laterally, and the sguamous part, sguama occipitalis, which is located posteriorly, right? So these three bones, they combine to form a very big foramen called a foramen magnum, right? So you can see here the first thing here, foramen magnum, of course. So this is the external surface, right? Right, so this is squama occipitalis. Squama occipitalis. So on the external surface of the occipital bone, the most prominent part is this protuberance, right? It's called the external occipital protuberance. Protuberantia occipitalis externa, right? If you go down straight, it forms a what? A cresta occipitalis externa, right? That's external occipital crest, right? It extends to the foramen magnum here. You can see the nuchal lines, right? Here is the superior nuchal line, linear nuchae superior, and here is the inferior nuchal line, linear nuchae inferior, right? Linear nuchae inferior. Sometimes here there is another one, like above the superior nuchal line, there is a supreme nuchal line, right? Linear nuchae suprema, right? Okay. Then let's go to the lower part here, right? So this is the condylar part, right? So fossa condylaris, and on the fossa condylaris there is a foramen here, or a particular, it's a canal, right? It's called a canalis condylaris, right? So okay, so those are just the parts. So the basilar part here, down here, you can see pars basilaris, right? That's the basilar part, and on that part you can see the tuberculum pharyngeum. Is a pharyngeal tubercle, right? Okay. So on the canal, I told you this canalis condylaris, that's where emissary veins pass through, right? Then there is a jugular notch, right? So in an intact skull, this part that's where the jugular foramen or jugular foramen, that's foramen jugularis. So in an intact, it will be located here, right? So there is a tubercle, right? So this one is actually a process, right? It forms the posterior part of the what? Of the jugular foramen, right? So on the jugular foramen, in the jugular foramen, posteriorly, there will be an internal jugular vein, and then anteromedially, you find the cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11, right? And here on this tubercle, that's where the fibrous capsule of the pharynx will be attached. That was about the external surface. So this is now the internal surface, right? So the internal surface, firstly, you can see this fossa, there are 4 parts, 2 superior and 2 inferior, right? So the superior ones, that's where the occipital lobes of the brain will be lodged into, and here that's where the lobes of the cerebellum will be lodged, cerebellum, right? So what's separating this into 4 fossae, right? So the most prominent thing here, like on the outside, is the what? This eminence is called eminentia cruciformis, right? Eminentia cruciformis. If you continue going up, is sulcus sinus sagittalis superior, right? It's a groove for the superior sagittal sinus. And as you go down, it forms the crest occipitalis interna, right? Then across, there is a sulcus again. It's called sulcus sinus transversi, right? It's groove for the transverse sinus, right? Then here you have your foramen magnum, and then the margins are very important. Margo lamboideus, this margin, and this margin is margo mastoideus, right? articulating with the mastoid part of the temporal bone, but we'll talk about it later. Right, and you can see the basilar part down there, pars lateralis, jugular notch, tuberculum jugulare, right? So this is the tubercle which I talked about previously. Right, processus jugularis, right, and here again you can see the canalis condylaris, right, and here there is a sinus, sulcus sinus sigmoide, right. This is the side view of the occipital, right. Okay, so here there is a squamous part. You can see the squamous part, right. So the basilar part of the occipital bone and the sphenoid bone, they fuse at around 18 years of age, right. They fuse, right. So we will talk about the sphenoid bone very soon, right. I just wanted to show you the hypoglossal canal down here and the tuberculum pharyngeum, right. Hypoglossal canal, that's for the 12th cranial nerve, right. Okay, so let's talk about the next bone, the parietal bone. Right, so this is the parietal bone, right. So it has two surfaces, the internal surface and the external surface, right. So this is the external surface, and on the external surface you find firstly these two lines, right. Superior temporal line here, linea temporalis superior, and the inferior temporal line, linea temporalis inferior, right. And there is a tuber, right, tuber parietale, right, tuber parietale. Okay, then you find borders, right. But borders are also known as margins, right. So this is margo sagittalis, that's where this parietal bone articulate with the other one, the left one. This one is the right parietal. I would tell you how to tell the side, because in class they will ask you to put it in an anatomic position, right. So I will give you a hint, right. But still on margins, I said this one is margo sagittalis, margo occipitalis, for articulation with the occipital bone, and here there is articulation with the frontal bone, is called what, margo frontalis, and down margo squamosus, right, for the articulation with the squamous part of the temporal bone. We'll cover it later, right. Next we'll talk about the angles, right. Angulus sphenoidalis down there. This is very important, but you just need to take your bone and look for this angle. It will help you to tell whether the bone is the left or right side, right. Okay, that's angulus sphenoidalis. Here there is frontal angle, angulus frontalis. Here there is occipital angle, angulus occipitalis, and here there is mastoid angle, angulus mastoideus, right. So this is the internal surface of the parietal bone, right. Again you can see the angles, right. Angulus sphenoidalis down there. You see, it's easy to tell whether this is which bone. So it's right parietal, right, because if you hold it on the anatomical position, you'll be able to see that. And this one, angulus frontalis here, angulus occipitalis, angulus mastoideus, right. And the margins, margo sagittalis, margo frontalis, margo occipitalis, and margo squamosus, right. So in the internal surface, on the internal surface, you find grooves, right. So these grooves belong to the arteries, right? So sulci arterios, right? And this one is very important. This one is the groove for the sigmoid sinus. This one, right? Sulcus sinus sigmoidae, right? Groove for the sigmoid sinus, right? Okay, the next bone, the sphenoid, right? So this bone is very important, right? So in general, this is the general orientation on the skull. If you look on the lateral side, you see it here in yellow. That's the sphenoid bone, right? And here in the, this one is basis cranii, right? Basis cranii, inside is the internal part, and you can see it, the sphenoid bone, right? Don't worry about other bones, we'll cover them. I just want to show you what it looks like. And remember, I was telling you about its articulation with the occipital, because this is the occipital, right? At the age of 18, there will be articulation, right? Okay, so let's look, right? So general orientation, right? So this bone has like four main parts, right? The body, right? This one is the body in blue, and then it is wings. This bone looks like a bat or a flying insect. That's why you see the naming, right? The wings, these are lesser wings, and these ones in this maroon color are greater wings, and in yellow, pterygoid processes. Right? Don't worry about the labels, I will talk about them, right? So firstly, this is the anterior view of the sphenoid bone, right? So this is the body, right? You can see the body of the sphenoid, right? So inside the body, there is an air space, right? Air space which is separated by a septum of the sphenoid, right? And here is an opening, is an apertura sinus sphenoidalis, right? The wings, you can see the greater wing here and the lesser wing here, right? The greater wing and the lesser wing, right? The greater wing is these important surfaces, the temporal surface, right? Facies temporalis on the outside, and the orbital surface, facies orbitalis on the inside, right? Okay. Here you can see, like anterior to this body, you can see the sphenoidal crest, cresta sphenoidalis, and it extends like a rostrum, right? So it's called rostrum sphenoidale. This, it extends like coming towards you. The down below the body, there is these processes. This process is called the vaginal process, processus vaginalis, right? And between this body and processus vaginalis, you see the sulcus vomerovaginalis. Okay, sulcus vomerovaginalis, right? Okay, so here you can see this fissure, a superior orbital fissure. That's fissura orbitalis superior. This one. Okay, so this one is the superior view, right? That was the anterior view. That's how you see it. All right. So other levels will cover them, like using other pictures. All right. So here you can see from top. Here is the optic canal for the optic nerve, right? Canalis opticus. Right? And then if you know, like this the second cranial nerve, right? Cranial nerve 2, it crosses at a certain point called optic chiasm, right? So on the sphenoid, there is an impression here. It's actually a groove called sulcus prechiasmatis. Right? Then there are these horns, right? These horns on the lesser wing, because this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. These horns are called what? Anterior clinoid process. Anterior clinoid processes. And on the back here is called a dorsum cell. Dorsum cell. Dorsum cell. And on its ends, you find the posterior clinoid processes. Processus clinoides posterior, right? Anterior, posterior, and then on the sides there are processes again. It's called what? Processus clinoides medius here, right? Processus clinoides medius here on the sides, right? Then this is a Turkish saddle, right? It's not very clear here. Turkish saddle is called Selatesica, right? And the fossa for the pituitary gland, fossa hypophysealis, right? Because the pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis, right? Right. And I showed you in the previous picture the superior orbital fissure, fissura orbitalis superior here, right? Let's go down to the next is the round foramen, foramen rotundum, this one. And going down again, you see the oval foramen, foramen ovale. And down towards the end, there's foramen spinosum, right? Okay, I'm sure I will show you on the next picture. It's called foramen spinosum because it's actually like next to the spine, because this sphenoid bone is a spine, right? Spine of the sphenoid bone, right? So here there is a groove on both sides. There is a groove for the carotid artery, right? It's called what? Sulcus caroticus, right? Okay, so you can see here what I was trying to say. The spina osseous sphenoidalis. This one is the spine of the sphenoid bone. Spine of the sphenoid bone, right? Okay, you can see major wing, right? Greater wing of the sphenoid, and this one, because this one is the posterior view, remember it's posterior view, so this surface is actually the what? The cerebral surface, right? You can see the lesser wing, right? Laminar, and then optic canal here, canalis opticus, and here there is dorsum cell, you can see it here, right? Labeled here, dorsum cell. Right, you can see the posterior clinoid processus clinoideus posterior, right? And anterior clinoid processus clinoideus anterior here, right? So here this part is the body, corpus osseous sphenoidalis, right? It's labeled here. I just didn't put a tick. Right, okay. So with the foramens going downwards, or the openings, here is the superior orbital fissure, fissura orbitalis superior. Here going down, the next one here is the round foramen rotundum, labeled here, right? And further down here there is a canal, right? It's called the canal, or the pterygoid canal, canalis pterygoideus. It's very important because it transmits the pterygoid nerve and vessels here, right? Just below that there is a groove, right? There is a groove for the carotid artery. I told you this one is called what? Sulcus caroticus, right? Okay, pterygoid processes, like the legs, right? So pterygoid processes, processus pterygoideus, have two parts, the lateral plate and the medial plate, right? Lamina lateralis and lamina medialis, right? lamina medialis. Okay, and then here there is a hook on the end of the lamina medialis. On the end is a hook-like structure. It's called humulus pterygoideus. That's where the tensor veli palatine attaches. That's the muscle of the soft palate. That's where it attaches, right? And again, on its continuation here, there is a notch. There is it's a notch, right, between the medial plate and the lateral plate. It's called incisura pterygoidea. Incisura pterygoidea, right? And here on the continuation of the humulus, and where this main part of the medial plate ends, there is a groove called sulcus humuli pterygoidea. Sulcus humuli pterygoidea, right? And then going up in between these two, there is a depression. It's a fossa. It's called a pterygoid fossa. That's fossa pterygoidea. Fossa pterygoidea. You can see here it's like a prominence here. It's not smooth. There's a prominence here. It's actually a process called pterygospine process, right? Processus pterygospinosus. Processus pterygospinosus, right? And here there is a right angled fossa, not right angle really, but you can see a turn here, and it's very clear. It's called a scaphoid fossa. Fossa scaphoidea. Fossa scaphoidea. Right, and then here there is a groove. This groove, don't confuse this groove with this fossa, because they are like similar and close to each other, right? So this groove is for the auditory tube, right? Sulcus tuba auditive, right? So this one, that's where the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube lodges, right? The bony part, it lodges in the what, in the same sulcus on sphenoid bone, right? We'll talk about it, not on sphenoid, on temporal bone. Temporal bone. On sphenoid, the cartilaginous part. All right. Okay, so here you can see, you can appreciate the sphenoid bone again, right? You see different parts with a color coding, right? Body, lesser wings, greater wings, pterygoid processes, right? Now starting on the top, optic canal, right? That's where the optic nerve goes through, and you can see the superior orbital fissure. Different nerves go through that. We'll talk about them later in skull as a whole. Round foramen, foramen rotundum, that's where the second branch of the fifth cranial nerve passed through, right? Is called the maxillary nerve, right? Maxillary nerve. And next is foramen ovale. Foramen ovale, that's where the V3, the third branch of trigeminal nerve, is mandibular nerve. It passed through foramen ovale. And then foramen spinosum. Foramen spinosum, that's medial meningeal artery, passes through this foramen, right? All right, you can see pterygoid processes, the medial plate and the lateral plate. All right, so this is how it looks like on the medial section, and this red line is just to appreciate the relationship between the pituitary gland, because it will be here. So it's this bone is very important, because that's where the pituitary gland is lodged in, right? Here there is a sphenoid sinus, right? Okay, don't worry about this whole part. We are going to talk about it in just a second. In the ethmoid bone, right? So ethmoid bone is going to be our last bone we are going to cover in this lecture. All right, so here you can appreciate like in general way it lies, right? So this one is the sphenoid, is the ethmoid bone, and this one section you can see it here, right? So it contains like foramens, little foramens, where the nerves, cranial nerve 1, ophthalmic nerves, they pass through into the anterior cranial fossa, right? Right, so I told you about the cribriform plate, right? So this one is the superior view of the ethmoid bone, right? And you see these foramens, what cribriform foramen, right? So this is lamina and foramina cribrosa, right? So the ethmoid is three parts: the perpendicular part, the cribriform plate, and the two ethmoidal labyrinth on the left and on the right. You can see, right? You will see it later, right? So these are plates or surfaces, right? So this one is lamina orbitalis, right? Lamina orbitalis. Okay, so if you still remember on the frontal bone, the I showed you like articulation with the ethmoid bone, right? So you can see here will be your anterior ethmoidal cells, middle ethmoidal cells, and posterior ethmoidal cells, because this bone, it is like a lot of these air cells, right? Cellular ethmoidal cells, right? Okay, but here let's go back like in order. So we covered what the cribriform plate, right? The next is the crista galli, right? So this one is the crista galli, and it has a little wings here called ala crista galli here, right? This plate, very important plate, is called the perpendicular plate, lamina perpendicularis, right? So this one, it extends down and anteriorly. You can see it here in green, right? You can see it here forming the nasal septum. This posterior part is in green. This is another view, inferior view, right? So on the inferior view, right, you see very big cells called ethmoidal bulla, right? Bulla ethmoidalis, right? So bulla ethmoidalis, on the side there is like a hook or like an uncinate process. It's called process sus uncinatus, and in between there is an infundibulum, right? Infundibulum ethmoidale, and you can appreciate again here, I said this one is the inferior surface. You see lamina perpendicularis, and here you see ethmoidal cells. Here you see the lamina cribrosa and foramina cribrosa. Here is another view, lateral view, right? So here there is this articulation with the frontal bone, because without it there will be little notches, but on articulation they form foramens. Foramen ethmoidale anteriors and foramen ethmoidale posteriors. That's the anterior ethmoidal foramen and posterior ethmoidal foramen. This is where the nerves and vessels of the same name pass through, right? You can appreciate the crista galli here, ala crista galli, right? Ethmoidal cells, cellular ethmoidales, right? Lamina orbitalis, the orbital plate. And here you can see a very important part is called a concha nasalis media, the middle nasal concha. I will show you another view to appreciate this, right? Biggest ethmoidal cells, bulla ethmoidalis, and the insunate process, right? Processus insulatus, and in between, I said you find the infundibulum. This is the perpendicular plate. So here you can see the ethmoidal labyrinth in yellow, right? So you can see here superior nasal concha here and the middle nasal concha here, right? Inferior nasal concha is a separate bone, right? We'll cover it later in viscerocranium bones, right? Okay, here is a crista galli in blue, and cribriform plate, you can see it here, the cribriform plate. The ethmoid bone, you can see it here, and also you can see here in yellow, right? Medial nasal concha, right? Superior nasal concha, right? And the perpendicular plate, you see it here forming the nasal septum, right? And the crista galli here, right?